Welcome back to AutoTechNick. Now I just had this beautiful 1997 Ferrari 456 GTA dropped off, and it is in the shop to get its timing belts replaced, or more commonly referred to as its major service. Before I just jump straight into this timing belt service, I need to get this car inspected and evaluated so I have a good understanding of the condition of the car and any additional repairs that it may or may not need. So, for today's video, I'm going to bring you guys along the process of doing a pre-service inspection on this 456. So you guys can probably see that this 456 is in outstanding condition cosmetically, and well, it should. It only has about 15,000 miles on it, so it is a very low mileage car. And I can tell you that this particular customer takes excellent care of his cars, especially the outside. He has a big detailing buff, and you can tell because all the cars that I get from him, the paint is pretty much flawless, polished out, and really just free of any defects or scratches. And well, that's good news because, to tell you guys the truth, it's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to have my hands on a 456, and the fact that we have what appears to be a very clean, low mileage car is going to make it a little bit easier because we're going to have to be exercising my memory pretty heavily on running through all the notes and details of these cars and things to look for. But I'm confident it's all going to come back to me once I get my hands on it and we're working through it. So I think the first thing that we're going to start off with today is getting the road test out of the way. So traditionally, Ferraris fall into two main categories for me, and that's the Grand Tours. So that would be the front engine V12 cars that are more built for, say, like long road trips. I like to refer to them as more of like a gentleman's car, where there's a little bit more emphasis on ride comfort, comfort in the car, a little bit quieter, nicer ride, just more suitable for longer road drives, basically. And then there's the other category traditionally, which is the sports car category, which is typically the mid-engine V8 Ferraris. Those cars are definitely a bit more track oriented, so you know, they're a shorter wheelbase, they're going to ride a little rougher, be a little stiffer because they're trading off that comfort for a focus on handling and performance. So up to this point on the channel, we've mainly had sports cars. So we've worked on some 430s, some 355s, and this is really one of the first GT cars that we've had on the channel. And I mean, the 456s, they're kind of a unique beast. They got the 4 seats, they're kind of big, luxurious, and it's really a radically different experience than, say, the earlier 355s that I was working on, although they're the same cars from the same era. Now granted, with this car being an automatic as well, it's a radically different driving experience. It's almost a bit more laid back and luxurious and just kind of going for, you know, like I feel like you're going for a Sunday cruise in these, whereas in a 355 you're a little bit more on edge and just really attack the roads and have a good time with them. So that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize with Ferraris. There's really those two distinct categories, and the driving experiences of either is radically different. And not to mention they're different from generation of car to generation of car. So the replacement of the 456 was the 612 in my opinion, and again, that's a very different experience than driving a 456. But they're still kind of catered to the same thing for the more casual, comfortable driving Ferrari. So far this car is driving great. We do have a couple warnings in the instrument cluster, but drivability is good, the ride is good, our handling is nice, feels the way it should. Our suspension's tight. I don't feel any looseness or play in the steering or suspension. I'm not hearing any noises. The interior of the car is nice and quiet, and I mean, really, as it seems so far, this car is pretty well sorted. Really not getting much of the note. You know, our steering wheel's nice and straight, so we have a good alignment. Transmission, well, it's shifting good, doing the best it can back there for a GTA. And we'll go ahead and get back on the freeway here. So I was able to build enough speed getting on the freeway where I was able to deploy the rear spoiler. It is a movable rear spoiler in this car, which is pretty unique for the era and time. Once we get the car in the lift, I'll give you guys a peek and show you how that works. But it does give me an indicator light in the instrument cluster, letting me know that that spoiler did deploy. So we're just a little brief trip back here on the freeway, and again, making sure the car tracks good, shifts good, we have it in high gear, and it's really doing all the things that it's supposed to be doing. So one of the chronic problems for 456s is the window regulators. They wear out prematurely, and also the window adjustment is really hard to get right, especially with a worn out or broken window regulator. Therefore, a lot of the times the windows in the 456s do not sit right because they're a frameless window, so there's no door frame to help guide the window up in the position onto the seals of the body. Why I'm saying this? There's a lot of wind noise on this car, and I do know that I do have a problem with the right-hand window that we're going to have to take a peek at, but that is something that is very common on 456s, unfortunately, so I'm not surprised to hear it. It's one thing that we will need to know. So we just made it back from our road test, and honestly everything went pretty much as I expected for such a low mileage clean car. There really wasn't a whole lot for me to note and document that I picked up on that wasn't working the way it should or was deviating from what I already kind of knew about the car. But now that we're back here in the shop, as we can see that the paint is in outstanding condition, this car has been very well maintained and taken care of over its life. And you step back, you'll notice that this car is actually on wheels that are off of a 550, so it gives it a little bit more of a current, updated look. And honestly, I kind of prefer these wheels on the 456 versus the 456 wheels themselves. Bolt right on, fit well, look great, and give you guys a bit of a walk around. And really, I mean, it's a 456. There's not a whole lot to talk about, except there is a couple things over here. Now, one of them is our fuel door here. That is one thing that the customer was complaining of. He is telling me that intermittently the electronic release for the fuel door is not operating properly, so we're going to need to take a look at that. The other thing, which I did mention on our road test, is our wind noise from the window and the window regulators. You notice right here I have a significant gap on that window. You can see straight in to the inside of the car. So this is caused by a couple different problems. One, this window is pushed up too far, which causes it to bow out. And I already had opened the door, and I've moved the window in the door, and I do have some play in the regulator, which probably is related to this. So that's something we're going to have to take the door panel off and start investigating and taking a look to see what the right course of action is, because either we have something wrong or broken or worn out on the regulator, or a best case scenario is the regulator's fine and it only needs adjustment. Now, if I open the door handle here, the window is going to drop down, and when I do, you'll see that the window fits like it should. It slides in and it gets tight. So you can see once it goes, open the door and shut it, and it slides up. Once it goes up is when it bows out. And I can't really do it here on camera, but I already had this open. You can see my fingerprints on it. but I was moving this window around, checking the play in that regulator just from a quick inspection. So the client and I have already briefly talked about the problem with the fuel door and the window, and really my objective here is I'm going to give those items a quick brief look to see what I think we need, so I can give them a rough idea of what we're looking at labor wise and what the ultimate cost of the repair is going to be. The fuel door probably won't be so bad, but the windows on 456s can end up being very time consuming, a lot of labor involved to get them adjusted correctly. And really, I just need to get the customer a good idea of what it's going to take to get that fixed so he can decide if that's something he wants to chase after or not on this car. But other than that, I mean, I see really nothing notable on this car. It's in very good condition, and I mean, there's not a lot of high failure or wear items on these cars. It's really more so checking out the condition of the paint, making sure that it's good, no evidence of damage, repaints. And I would say the biggest thing on the 456s is the function of the door locks, and the biggest is the windows. So the problems with the door locks on these cars is similar to 550s. A lot of the grease kind of dries up over time, it gets real thick, it gets sticky, and that prevents the lock mechanisms from working correctly. Then that prevents the micro switches from registering the proper lock movement, and then they don't work correctly. So the fix for those is generally just taking everything apart, cleaning all the old grease out, putting new grease in, readjusting everything, and the operation is back to where it should be. I would say more times than not on these older cars, 550, 456 era, you need to go through and clean, lube, and adjust things as opposed to just replacing things. So that's primarily the things you want to be looking for on the outside of the body of the car. Honestly, our body inspection on the car is 99.9% cosmetic and not really functional. But we still do run through and get that inspected. We really need to jump on the inside of the car to where we start getting into functional testing of items and making sure everything's working the way it should be. Now that we're inside the 456, there's going to be a lot more things that we have to cover and talk about. I'm going to start up here in our instrument cluster, and if you notice, our slow down light's going to be on because I don't have the engine running, but you'll notice that I have an airbag light on and a check engine light on. And I will say that if I fire this car up, we'll disable our immobilizer here. We fire that up. Our airbag light and our check engine light will not extinguish. They will stay on full time. Shut the car off. So that is something the client didn't know about, and that's something that we're going to have to take a quick peek on. So once we get this car to the point where we have the SD1 hooked up, we're going to need to read the faults out of the airbag and the NCMs and see if we have, again, we're not going to jump straight into full diagnosis on those items. I'm going to take a quick peek, look at the faults, and really just get some information so that way I can present it to the client and see if he wants me to go deeper on the resolution for the check engine light and the airbag light. Now there is one more thing that he was complaining about in the car, and I did have it happen to me when it first got dropped off. It has not done it since. And that is the detent to get this out of reverse and in the drive. So I have the key on right here, and if you're real quiet, you might be able to hear a little noise coming from this area when I push the brake pedal and release it, which is that detent moving in and out on the side. So I'm going to push the pedal now and see if we can hear it. So you can hear it. It went 3 times. It was pretty loud. You'll notice the shifter plate trim screws are off, and that's because the detent was getting stuck and you couldn't get the car out of park or in the reverse. So the client had this unscrewed so he could reach in and manually move that lever out of the way and get the car in and out of gear. So if we jump back when I was on the outside of the car and I was discussing the door locks, and a lot of times on these cars it comes down to the grease. This is one of those things and items that's probably what it could be, or at least that's my hunch. So I'm going to need to take all this trim apart and get access to that solenoid. I need to make sure that it's operating correctly, which I know it is now, but I need to see if it has any grease on it that's getting sticky and dry, and that's why it's intermittently getting stuck. Perhaps if the car sits for a long time, it doesn't see any use, it kind of seizes in place. Once you free it up and move it, it starts working again, which is a symptom of that problem. Now that we're in here talking about that grease, I'll show you on the door locks with this door open. So this lock rod right here actually has a micro switch or a turnbuckle that runs the actuator and a micro switch on it. And a lot of times when you have the same grease problem or a misadjustment, if the doors are shut, your locks will pop up like that. My doors are open now, so that's normal. So that is a problem if they won't stay locked. We'll shut this door and we can lock our doors and see that they stay in place. And sometimes it may be a problem just on one side. Again, off memory, I have not replaced anything on a 456/550 relating to a door lock. I've had many of them where they don't work. It always comes down to grease and adjustment of the turnbuckle and micro switch. This car, everything seems to be working great, which is nice because we don't have to dive in there and deal with it. And I guess I probably should mention that I'm going to reference 550s pretty heavily in this video. Honestly, we can say 575 also, because the 456, all variants, the 550 and the 575 are very, very similar in construction on the way they're put together, the way they function. There's not a lot of differences, and they, in my eyes, as a technician working on the cars, I view them as essentially the same car. Sure, I'm going to have a little bit different modules in terms of ABS, NCMs, engine computers. This car happens to be an automatic, so we have an automatic ECU for the transmission. You know, the later 550s, a lot of them have F1 transmissions, so there's small variances that way. But if you want to talk about the way the door lock system works, the location of ECUs, just the basic philosophy of how the car is built and the platform that it's built on, they are all pretty much the same. Just small deviations throughout the years, the model, and the style of the car. All right, continuing on with exploring the inside of this car. Now, one of the things that you want to look for is really the interior finish on these cars, meaning the condition of the leather, because a lot of times they start to bubble or lift or warp. So you can see that all the leather on this car is in outstanding shape. It is staying in place and there's really no flaws or defects. And I would say two of the biggest problems of most of the older Ferraris is leather lifting and sticky no more. So when I say sticky no more, I'm referring to the factory soft touch finish, the black finish that's on almost all the interior handles, switches, buttons, and covers. And over time that finish degrades and it gets sticky. When it first starts degrading, it gets mildly sticky, and then as it continues to get worse, it gets like slimy, and it will stain your clothes, your hands. The stuff is absolutely atrocious. And fortunately, on this 456, all of the switches have the painted silver finish to match all the rest of the trim on the car. So the amount of items in this car that actually have that sticky soft touch finish is very minimal, meaning even as that finish degrades, there's not as many items that would need to be addressed and sent off because it's a very expensive repair to have that done properly. So on this particular car, it's things like the instrument cluster trim or the steering column trim right here. That has the soft touch finish. You can't see it on the seat, but there is the handle for the seat tilt to get into the back. And I will say that on the passenger side, that handle actually is starting to get a little bit sticky. And honestly, so far, that is the only item that I have found that is sticky. So that's just a few of the things that came to mind that you want to look for in your 456, 550, 575. I have not inspected this car yet, so I'm just walking you guys through it as I sit in here and things just kind of jump into the memory. But I'll come back and do a full inspection of the car, and if I find anything different or new that we didn't talk about, I'll definitely bring you guys back and show you that. But now, let's go take a peek in the trunk. Check it out. This car has the factory luggage kit on it, and by the looks of this luggage kit, it doesn't appear to have ever been used. And this is a pretty cool option. You don't see that a lot on the older cars with the full factory leather luggage. And you can see right there, labeled 456. So this all appears very brand new. Only got one hand here, I don't want to set it down. But you can see that we have all of our luggage and our toolkits in there. Again, when I go through my full inspection, I'll pull that toolkit out, make sure everything's good. We'll check the date on our tire fix-a-flat canister. That is very frequently expired. And well, if the client gets a flat tire and that doesn't work, they're kind of in a jam. So you can see all of our luggage. And since this is a GTA, you can kind of catch a glimpse of it right here. Underneath this trim panel is another access panel that you unbolt. And that gives me access to the transmission, because although it is an automatic transmission, it is mounted here at the rear of the car and connected to the engine with a torque tube. So not a whole lot to see here in the trunk other than this beautiful luggage, but we'll keep this luggage in the car where it's safe and sound for now, because I'll need both hands to get all that out and do our inspections. So last thing we need to check out is under the hood. All right, that right there is a very common problem on the older cars, and it's just as simple as the gas escapes from these struts, they lose their charge, and they don't hold the hood up very frequently. I will say that if you've ever experienced this, or sometimes it may be intermittent, and that's because it's very temperature related, meaning as I drive the car, it builds some heat in the engine, the gas in those shocks expands, builds a little bit more pressure, and it may hold the hood up. Or you may have your hood held up, you're working on the car, then it starts to fall down on you. Fortunately, it's a pretty quick and relatively inexpensive fix to get those struts replaced, so it's not much of a problem anymore. But for now, come under here and see if I can get this done with one hand. We'll lock that guy in place, and you can see that it's significant of enough of a problem that I just keep that handy, so when I'm working on these cars I can keep everything up and out of my way. But now we have a good view of our V12 here, and this really shares a lot of similarities with all of the Ferraris of the era. Everything on this car is twos, meaning it has two ECUs, one for each side of the engine, two airflow meters. When you're diagnosing these cars, you kind of got to really be sure what you're looking at and why, so you don't get too mixed up on side to side, because everything crosses. And it's very easy to get things mixed up with the wiring of, say, fuel injectors and O2 sensors. And I actually have a really great story about that I might get into a little bit later, on a diagnosis that I had on another 456 GTA. Through a lot of people, a lot of different shops for loops on it, no one could really solve it. Ended up with me, and I was able to get that sorted, and it is specifically related to the wiring. But in here, visually, it's very clean. You can see we have our timing belt covers. So for our timing belt service that we're going to be getting into in this car, our engine will stay in the car. We do not need to pull it out, and we will be able to get the timing belts replaced. I do pull the intake manifold and valve covers because I need to check our valve adjustments, make any changes on our shims there if needed. Also, the valve covers being off is going to give me access to degree in the camshafts, and yes, there will be room to get a degree wheel onto the crankshaft, all the tooling set up, and run through the camshaft degreeing. So honestly, to tell you guys the truth, the amount of labor and time it takes to do a timing belt service, say on this 456, is the same as it takes, say, on the 355 I did a while back. Now on the 355, sure, I had to drop the engine out, so it takes more time to get the engine out of the car. But then once the engine is out, it's actually quicker to run through the timing belt service. Whereas on this car, I don't need to spend the time to remove the engine. I leave it in the car, but it actually takes me longer to run through the belt service because of things like the valve adjustment, and also because I have more things to work around as I'm working through the timing belt service. So very different scope of work on how we achieve the same thing, which is replacing the timing belts. But at the end of the day, both jobs, depending on the two different types of cars, take roughly the same amount of time, which is around 40 hours to do that job. Now, if you're not pulling your intake manifold and valve covers, you're not checking your valve adjustment, and you're not degreeing your camshafts, sure, it's going to take you a lot less time, and it's not going to, run up the same bill when you're getting the car serviced. I bring all this up because it's just important to know, if you're paying for someone to do a timing belt service on your car, it doesn't matter if it's a 456, 550, 355, 348, 360. It really doesn't matter. What matters is if you understand the scope of the work that you're doing. So if you're shopping around for timing belt services, you need to understand what they are and are not doing. Some shops believe that you only need to replace the timing belts and tension them. You don't need to check the camshaft timing. Therefore, they're not removing the valve covers. They're not replacing any camshaft seals. They're just pulling the front covers, timing belts on, back together. Now, personally, I do not do timing belt services that way, and I think I could make a whole separate video on the pros and cons of doing a timing belt service that way or not. That's not what I want to talk about right now. The point I want to make is, if you're shopping for a timing belt service and you're comparing prices from shop to shop to shop, you need to inquire with what they're doing during that service so you can compare the price. Because if you get a price from two shops and say there's a $2,000 difference, it doesn't seem that bad, and you may take the shop that's $2,000 cheaper to do the belt service. However, that shop might not be pulling the valve covers, might not be replacing any of the seals, might not be degreeing in the camshafts, doesn't clean the injectors. They might be cutting a lot of work out of the major service that the other shop might be doing, where that extra $2,000 actually might be giving you a lot better service on the car. So my main point is when you're shopping for a timing belt service and shopping different shops, don't just ask for the price. Inquire with the scope of work they do and have it individualized or itemized so you understand what they're doing. because if you're just looking at the price, you might find a shop that's charging full price and doing half the work, meaning that shop's getting a great deal and you're not getting that good of a service on your car. So I think where we're going to go from here is I need to set you guys down. I need to go through my service checklist here, get this car inspected, and really get it looked over. I need to focus on that, not focus on the camera talking to you guys. So I'm going to get the car looked over. We're going to run through the inside real quick. I'm going to do my basic inspection on the engine, my fluid levels, my light operation, brake, suspension, ball joints, tire tread, etc. You get the point. Once I'm done, I'll bring you back. We're going to talk about anything that I found. And then from there, we needed to move into the more specific and unique items on this car, because since we're doing a timing belt, I need to run through, do a compression test. We need to do a pre-service emissions test. We also need to get our SD1 out, hook it up to the car. We need to take a peek at that check engine light, take a peek at that airbag light. So there's a lot more things that we need to do to this car before we really jump in and start doing the work. So I'm going to work to get this inspection out of the way so I can bring you guys back to get to the interesting stuff that I know is what you're here to see. Morning guys, we're back out continuing on our 456 inspection. And yesterday when I set you guys down, I ran through all the basics of the car. So shaking down the suspension, just getting the under panels off the car, getting a good peek at the car. I also did get my SD1 over there set up, and I spent quite a bit of time running through the ECUs on the car. Mainly what I'm looking for at the SD1, or what I'm looking at, comes down to the NCMs. I'm really in there looking for faults, but also the parameters. So when I say parameters, that is the live data of the sensor outputs, what they're reading when the engine is running. So I like to capture all those before I do the service. That way on the tail end of the service, once the car is running, let's say I have the car running poorly or not as well as it was before the service, I have a reference point to look back at that data to be sure that the car is running the same or better than when it initially came in on that information. Now obviously when I have the SD1 hooked up, I'm able to read the faults that we had stored in the car pertaining specifically to the check engine light, so I have a pretty good lead on what that is. We'll talk about that in a little bit when we go over all the results of what we find on the car. But I also did attempt to scan the airbag control unit to see what our airbag light is on for, and I was having no luck getting my SD1 to communicate to the airbag control unit. Now I also happen to have a Leonardo tester which has full functionality on this 456 as well, and again, the Leonardo, no dice. I am unable to communicate to the airbag control unit. I did some basic checks, checking the fuses, power supply, but I think the reality of the situation is I'm going to need to gain access to the airbag control unit, and I'm going to have to do some checks at the connector and make sure my powers are good, my grounds are good, and my communication wire to the airbag control unit is good. So on that one, it's not as easy and straightforward as just reading a fault and kind of going from there. We're going to have to go and diagnose the control unit itself and our communication issue, and that could actually be the cause of the airbag light or not, but we really won't know until we can communicate with it. So that was really my yesterday. I ended up spending way more time than I wanted to with the SD1. So we're back out here today, and now that the car is cold and has sat overnight, I'm kind of going to pivot a little bit. We're going to take a break from the SD1, and I'm going to take advantage of the cold car. As you can see, I have my smoke tester set up, and we are going to smoke test all the exhaust manifolds. Now, on this car, it essentially has 4 separate exhaust manifolds. So on each side of the engine, they're broken down into banks, the front 3 cylinders and the rear 3 cylinders. So 2 manifolds per side. Now it's not as common to see failed exhaust manifolds on the V12 cars, say as compared to the 355s, 360s, 430s. However, I still have seen them fail. They can crack, and they cause a little bit different symptoms on them. I remember one car that we actually had in the dealership for quite a while, chasing secondary air faults forever. I looked at the car a couple times, never really found the source. And I will say that we didn't have a good habit of smoke testing V12 exhaust manifolds at the time. Another newer technician came in, he went through, smoke tested it, found cracked manifolds. Lo and behold, that was our faults there. So really, since we had that car, that was a good learning lesson. I smoke test all of my exhaust manifolds now, especially when I have access up here on the emissions test port, which this is feeding in to our secondary air rail that goes into the manifold. So I'll bring you guys around and show you. I just stuff a couple towels loosely in the tailpipes, and that seals up the exhaust enough. And we're going to go through, get our smoke machine turned on. Actually, have this one over here. So we're going to start over here on the front one for cylinder 1 or bank 1. We're going to take this little emissions cap off. I already had this one loose. And be careful on these caps when you reinstall them, because they're a little brass cap, and if you over torque them, it will crack the top of this cap off and it won't seal anymore. It'll just keep spinning down the threads and lift the top off. So be gentle when you're installing these. Alright, so we got our shop air hooked up to our tester, our power's on. We're going to turn that on the max, and we're always just going to leave this here. Make sure we get some smoke coming out of it. There we go. You guys can see that. And just slide it on our nipple. And we're going to have a little bit of residual smoke in here from me getting that hooked up and connected on. It looks like that one's kind of whisking out of our connector still, which is okay. See if I can push my hose on further. And I'll grab a different light. So, why we're smoke testing this, really, the smoke is generally going to rise, so we're just kind of taking a peek over here in the manifold and just looking for any traces of smoke. And a lot of times where it's going to be leaking, well, since the manifolds have those heat shields that they're completely encompassed in, where it's going to leak from is from the edges around the perimeter of the manifold. So it's not necessarily going to leak where the leak is at on the pipe, it's just wherever it can escape the heat shield. So you can see up here, like on these ports, there's a small gap there on that weld. It'd be leaking out of there, but it's usually up by the front flanges by the heads because they're not sealed very well up there, and that's usually where it would be leaking from. All the edges of the heat shield around the perimeter are actually folded over and crimped, and they seal pretty well. So now that we have the smoke machine set up on the manifold, we're just going to give it a couple minutes to test, make sure that there's no leaks. Once we determine that it's either good or bad, we're just going to disconnect everything, get the rear manifold tested, and get the other two manifolds tested, and hopefully everything works out okay on this car. Like I said, I've seen them fail on V12s. It's not as common, not as typical, I would say. It's still possible. It's worth checking. So I'm going to get these manifolds checked out, and we'll continue on with this inspection. Alright, so we've been running it up here for a couple minutes, and you can see that we have no whispers of smoke at all up here in the engine bay. And I'll take you back here and show you this because it's worth noting. And if you look carefully, you can see we have the smoke whisking around back here, which that's a good sign because that's telling me I have the entire exhaust full of smoke. And it's leaking out back here, which is okay. Really, if we have a leak with the smoke and it's past the O2 sensors, it's not that critical. But these are back here leaking out from where I have my rag stuffed in there. And again, we'll come up here to the front. Zero smoke, no leaks. So we know that the system's full of smoke. We know that this one manifold is good. Now it's time to get the rear one. Alright, and it's looking like the same thing over here on the rear one. We have no smoke up here in the engine bay. And again, you can see the back of the shop, just smoke billowing out everywhere. So we're 2 down, 2 more to go. Okay, we're running up here on the front manifold. Once again, nothing showing up in the engine bay. We'll come to the back. Yep, I already see all of our smoke back here. So 3 down, 1 more to go. Alright, last but not least, the rear manifold. Smoke's going in there. No leaks up in the engine bay. We already did our check back at the car. Again, we have the smoke leaking out of the exhaust pipes. That's fine. And that's telling me everything we need to know. It confirms that we have smoke in the system. And we have no smoke leaking out of the manifolds. That's really what we're checking. We want to be sure that's what we confirm is good. So we don't have any cracks, any leaks, any warped flanges. They're sealed nice and tight. Now I will say that I do prefer to smoke test exhaust manifolds when they're cold versus when they're warm. It's easier to work on, but I usually find that when there's a small or a minor leak, sometimes it's more prominent when the car is cold versus when it's up to temperature and hot. Now that we confirmed that our exhaust manifolds are good, it's time to move on to our next check. And as you can probably hear, you can hear the car ticking and popping, that I had it running and I've already brought it fully up to temperature. And the next thing that we're going to be doing is running through and we're going to be pulling the emissions or reading the emissions from the same test ports on each manifold where we just did our smoke test. So this is a 5-gas emissions analyzer. It's going to tell us our CO, hydrocarbons, CO2, O2, NOx, and our air-fuel ratio. And that's going to be doing it for each manifold. Now I'm going to pull readings with the car at idle and also 3,000 RPM. So to make things easy for myself, I have the SD one set up over here, so I'll be able to read my engine RPM, and I'll just be able to act on the throttle right here, so I can hold it at the RPM. I can glance over, make sure I'm at the right RPM, so then I can reach down and hit print on my printer. You can see that it takes just a little bit of coordination to get that all set up. And I usually do idle all the way around on all four, then come back and do the elevated RPM, 3000 RPM on all four. So one thing to note when you're doing it at the 3000 RPM, you do have to rev the car up, hold it at 3000 RPM, and kind of let everything stabilize. Really try not to let the engine accelerate or decelerate, because that will change your emissions reading. I watch my gauge here for my numbers to stabilize, so I'm kind of making sure I'm staying true at my RPM. And then my main one I like to keep an eye on is my hydrocarbons. That really tells me if I get a good stable number that's holding true, go ahead and capture that reading at that point and print that out. So I need to come back here, and thankfully I have this fan so I can breathe. And we need to get this car fired back up. We're up and running. Reconnect our tester. So you can see we're good. We're up the temperature. Next page. We're in closed loop, which is what we want. Our emission tester is warmed up, ready to go. So I'm going to have to set you guys down so I can pull these readings. So I spent 20 years in dealerships working on these cars, and I've learned that efficiency is really the name of the game. And when I do these pre-service inspections, I am actually very routine and regimented in how I do it. I have a specific process, because for me, that is the most efficient way to do it. So we always start with a pre-drive to get a good evaluation of the car, get it on the road, make sure it drives well, make sure we know how it drives when the customer drops it off. Then I bring it back in, get it on the lift, get a good look over of the car, function test everything, look underneath of it, inspect it, shake down the suspension, get our under trays off. That really just gives me a good broad overview of the condition of the car and kind of what it needs. But also, the time it takes to do that inspection lets the engine cool down. Now, generally I perform this inspection all in one day, and by letting the car cool down on the rack while I do all the rest of the inspections, gives it a chance to get down to ambient temperature where I can smoke test the exhaust. Then, after we smoke test the exhaust, I'm free to fire it back up, let it build some temperature, we can pull our emissions test, and the last thing we need to really worry about when it's warm is a compression test, and that's where we're at right now. But you can see that I have a very specific process and routine and pattern that I do these things in, because it's really honestly just the most efficient way to go about it. So I save the compression test generally towards the end, because you got to pull the spark plugs out, obviously. And a lot of times on these services, the valve covers are coming off, and you're going to have the spark plugs replaced anyway, so I can leave all the spark plug wires out, leave the spark plugs out, put in the new ones, and it just kind of saves from having to repeat work. Although, unfortunately, on this car, we do have the check engine light, so I know I'm going to need some more diagnostic time with the car, meaning I know I'm going to have it running, so I am going to have to put it back together. Now that we're finished with the emissions test, I'm going to take advantage while the engine's still warm and get our compression test knocked out but I wanted to show you my setup on how I do the compression test, because there are some things that can affect your overall outcome of the readings that you get. One of the main things I like to do is I run a stabilized power supply on the car. So that's a Midtronics power supply that's actually specifically made for like when you're programming cars, and its main function is to output a very consistent, steady output in voltage and amperage, but mainly or specifically, it has an output of 55 amps. So a lot of battery chargers are probably say 10, 15 amps, which is not very much at all. That's enough to charge a battery, but that's not enough necessarily to keep the battery at the exact same state of charge while we're running the starter for all the cylinders of this compression test. So the benefit of that is it's going to keep the battery, or at least let's say ignore the battery, it's going to keep the voltage and amperage of the starter the same through all 12 cylinders, so we have a consistent reading from each cylinder. We want to keep that starter cranking at the same speed for each cylinder. Now, one of the other things I like to do when I'm running my compression test is the hook up a remote start switch. I generally don't like getting into the car and trying to crank it over for a couple of reasons. One, access isn't great getting in and out of the car. I don't want to have to lean into the car. But also, I don't like running the key and running the ignition when I have the spark plug wires off or the coils off and all that spark energy is trying to find a ground. So I hook up just my starter bypass switch. It's pretty easy. I just have it hooked up over here on the battery. And then this red wire here is just an extension lead, and it's the other side of my starter switch, running all the way over to the starter solenoid on the starter. And that gives me all the access I need where I can stand up here, crank it over, easy peasy. Now, the last thing that I'm pretty specific about on any compression test is on the inside of the car. You can see I have my brake pedal depressor on the car. You might not be able to see down there on the bottom, but I have that holding the throttle pedal wide open. So that is important because when you're running the compression test, you want to make sure that you have equal air going through the plenums, into all the runners, into each cylinder, so you have a consistent reading. Now, this particular car has a pretty decent sized plenum, so that plenum kind of acts like a buffer if you're cranking the car over with the throttles closed, and it's not as dramatic, I would say, but it still can affect your reading. Now, on cars with ITBs, like the 355 we serviced a while back, or even if you're running on a carbureted car, it's pretty common on the carbureted Ferraris, say a V12 runs 6 2-barrels, where 1 barrel for each carburetor is individualized and runs and feeds just to one cylinder. There's no community plenum at all on those. And if you think about the volume or space in between a closed throttle plate on an ITB car or a carbureted car down to the valve, it's incredibly small. So that really amplifies that effect, and you're going to have really erratic readings, and then you'll think you have a bad cylinder. And then if you actually run the compression test again with the throttles all the way open, everything normalizes and it's the way it should be. So I learned that the hard way. It bit me in the ass a couple times. So knowing that having a closed throttle is going to have a radical effect on our compression test, really my train of thought is it doesn't matter if I have the plenum that acts as a buffer. I want to maximize the consistency of the test that I'm doing, so I want to eliminate any variables that could alter or skew my readings. I want true, consistent readings through and through. So on every car, whether it be an ITB car, a carbureted car, or something with large plenums that kind of buffers that air and lets enough air get into that cylinder and feed it as we're cranking it over, doesn't matter. Throttle's always wide open. And the last thing that I like to do that I'm real specific on is I basically count how many times that cylinder builds compression or how many compression cycles it goes through. And I usually just start off of the first cylinder. I count and watch my gauge until the gauge stops building compression. And however many compression cycles that one cylinder has, I do the same on all the cylinders all the way around the engine. So it's usually around 10 or 12 compression cycles to have the gauge stop. And again, that's all ensuring that I get a consistent reading. So I want the same battery voltage and amperage for each cylinder when I'm cranking the starter over. I want the same airflow for each cylinder when I'm doing it. I want a warm engine, and I want the same amount of revolution, so the same opportunity for that cylinder to build the compression. That's going to give me a true story. I know it's a lot of nitpicky details that some people probably don't think it matters, but for me, eliminating variables, being as consistent as possible, that's what's important to me. What's the saying? Assume nothing, optimize everything. I think that kind of shows what I'm after here. So let's get this compression test out of the way. All right, cylinder 1. $215. 215. And 215 again. I'm liking what I'm seeing. 215. 205. 215. 'That one's about 218. Strong little guy. 219. 219. 210. 220. 'The last one's 220. So I'm really happy with our compression test results. I mean, our lowest cylinder was 205 psi, our highest was 220. Most all of them were at 215, 218. So really our deviation from our lowest to highest isn't very big at all. And really our grouping of the mass of the cylinders is right there, all in the same range. And that gives us a really good indication that the engine's sealing up well in the cylinders, the heads are sealing up, we don't have any valve guide issues, and we could presume that the camshaft timing is the same from bank to bank. We don't necessarily would know if it's correct, but the numbers are probably very close to the same, because if you have your camshaft timing wildly out of spec, that will change your cranking compression. So knowing that we have a good healthy engine, we can move forward, and we also have a baseline knowing where the compression is at. Let's go over a few other areas, the talking points that you keep an eye on, or areas you should look at on these 456s. Now, I will say that these V12s do tend to suffer from intake manifold gasket failures, and when I do the timing belt services on these, I pull the entire plenum off the engine. So it's a 3-piece manifold. There's the centerpiece and these end caps here. I pull the entire piece off, and that gives me more working room. It also gives me access to get the valve cover pulled off, and it allows me to replace those gaskets. So those gaskets get replaced frequently enough to where generally they don't fail while the car's out on the road, unless someone's really stretching their service. I have seen people that prefer to pull the plenums off of the intake manifold and leave the intake manifold on so they can get the valve covers off during the timing belt service, and I prefer not to do that for the simple reason that I can get in and get those intake manifold gaskets replaced as part of the service. And it's really not a lot of work to get this manifold off. It looks worse than it is, and once it's off, you have tons of working space. These valve covers, valve cover gaskets pushing out. We can come over here on this top one and kind of show you that this gasket's starting to push out right there on the side. Now, these valve cover gaskets on this 456 and the way they seal is pretty much the exact same as we had on the 355 we serviced a while back. Uses the individual paper gaskets that you kind of break apart, cut the fit. It has the O-rings on the end plates. So they suffer the exact same problems where the gaskets slide out, the O-rings get pinched. And once I have this car apart, I'm going to take a peek at everything. I'm going to make sure that the cylinder heads have been modified where the edges have been beveled so it does not cut into the O-rings. And I'm also going to make sure that the rails of the cylinder heads and the valve cover are peened or staked, so it kind of gives it that raised material where it's going to allow that to bite into the gasket, so that way the gaskets don't push out. Now, another item that's specific to these V12s, the 456, the 550, 575, 612, so really this generation of belt-driven V12 is your harmonic balancer. We'll take a better look of it underneath the car, but you want to get a good inspection on that. You can do it when it's in the car with a mirror, but really it's best once the balancer's off to really inspect it, because there's this steel center hub, there's the steel outer ring, and it's bonded on with a piece of rubber, and that rubber degrades, starts to crack, and can fail, and you can have the balancer fail. That can have the balancer walk back into the timing belts, and obviously that could be a catastrophic engine failure. It's a very common problem. It happens on a lot of cars, especially as they age and get older. So you want to inspect that, make sure the condition of that rubber is good, and if you have one that's bad, you either replace the balancer, or there is a few people out there that will rebuild them for you. So another common wear item on these belt-driven V12s is your water pump, which is housed right up the top of the engine behind this cover. We don't have very good access to see it right now, but it is something that you want to pay attention to and really take a peek at. Now, I will say on this car that I have not put a coolant pressure tester on it, and that is because I know that I have coolant leaks on the radiator, and I don't want to make the mess much bigger. But once I get those covers off during the belt service, I'll be able to look underneath and I'll check the integrity of the water pump. I'll be able to see if there's any evidence of coolant that's been leaking out. Now, those water pumps are pretty unique because they're fully rebuildable. So you can buy all the parts individual of one another. So you can buy the housing, the shaft with bearings, the impeller, or the water pump seal. Now, the water pump seal is actually very unique because it has like a compressed carbon seal ring in it. And the installation depth is very critical because there's two different pieces and their relation to one another, and where that carbon rides on the sealing surface dictates the seal. Really the only way to get them assembled and rebuilt if you're replacing that seal is with a special tool to press them in. I have done one on the very first one I ever rebuilt because I didn't really know any better without a special tool, and I went through I think 3 seals before I got the one in and didn't damage it. So it's just something to be aware of. There's plenty of people now that make aluminum seals or installation tools for those seals, or 3D printed ones that you can buy with the seals. They get them installed so you can press them in and not have to worry about the height of that piece of carbon. So that's another area to keep an eye on. So we have our water pump, our valve covers, our intake gaskets. We talked about it earlier, our manifolds leaking, and obviously we have the timing belts that are in for the service, but those aren't a high failure rate item, so to speak. But again, once these covers off, we'll be able to get in there and inspect them. Now, you'll notice that I have the airflow meters out right now, and that's because I have my suspension actuators out. So again, I mentioned it earlier, this car is incredibly similar to the 355 of the era. Ferrari did things very similar throughout the era of cars. So although this is a 456, not a 355, all the subsystems and subcomponents are the same. So, example, we have the same Bilstein adjustable suspension. It has the same actuators. It's the same operation. It's nearly the same ECU. This particular car here, it's a 1997. So it's using the Bosch 5.2 ECU. It does have 2 of them, one for each bank. A 355 uses one Bosch 5.2. So the earlier 456s were 2.7, again 2 ECUs. The early 355s, Bosch 2.7. You get the trend. So Ferrari basically did the same thing for each car that they built in that era, but applied them differently. So going back to our suspension actuators, we need to pull them off during our inspection. And you want to look inside and make sure that that gear is not broken. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little gear in there, and it kind of feels like it's broken because it's loose and it will move inside that housing. But what you're looking for is you don't want that gear to be split in half. Now, you need to come down to the shocks. Let me grab a light. You can see what we're doing here. So we got our light, move our spark plug wires, and this can't get you guys in here. I'll show you what's going on. Let's zoom you in. There we go. Nope. Alright, so I wasn't able to get the camera in there and get it to focus on the shock actuator, so I'll show you on the rear ones. But there is a cast little aluminum nut, or not nut, but like a splined adapter that sits on the top of that shock shaft. That also will split in half and break, but you want to make sure that that is in one piece. You want to make sure that it rotates to its end stop in either direction freely, and you also want to make sure that there's no fluid leaking out of the top of the shock. Those are common wear items on those shocks. And if you have a broken gear, again, I'll show you in the back ones, if that little gear on top of the shop is broken, you can replace it with new ones. I believe Hill Engineering makes them. If you have a cracked gear inside this actuator, now that we have a light, maybe I'll be able to show you. If that gear is cracked inside there, you'll need to replace your actuator up on top. And if your shock is leaking, you'll need to either replace it or rebuild it. Now, a couple things to note here. On these actuators, you can put them on anywhere once you take them off. There's no indexing to them. The system self-calibrates once you turn the key on, so it's pretty simple when you want to do the inspection. Just pop them off, take your visual inspection, pop them back on. So I'll give you guys a little bit of a bonus tip here. It does not apply to the 456s, but this does apply to the 550s. And that is the 550 has a failure of the upper shock mount. Again, we can't really get in there and see it, but the upper shock mount on the 550 fails and allows the shock to spin. So this gold cup, you can see right up on top of the shock right there, it allows that gold cup to spin. And when that gold cup spins, since that actuator is splined to it, that actuator spins, and it will end up going and twisting this actuator cable up extremely tight and eventually damage the wiring to that cable. So that's a very common problem on 550s, and I, a long time ago, years ago, worked with a company where we went and revised the shock mounts and kind of made it similar to like how it is on a 575 to fix that problem. And I don't think they offer that service anymore. I'm not sure if anyone else is out there making those parts to do that. You could replace the upper shock mount from the 550, but it's an inherent design flaw of the part, not necessarily a failure of the part. They updated the shock mounts on the 575, but they moved away from that style suspension. They moved to a different style, so you can't retrofit the 575 mounts up on there. So it's just one thing to keep an eye of. If you look at your shock actuators and you see a twisted wiring to it, that's why, and you need to address the upper shock mount on it. And if the wiring's twisted up and it's not that bad yet, you can usually use a heat gun, gently heat it up and kind of reform it and shape it to where it needs to be. So I think that's pretty much going to cover it here on the top side of the engine bay. However, I do have a few things to show you inside the car. So this is one of those areas where a little thinking ahead goes a long ways. Since you can see we don't have a lot of space to getting the door open here where we're going to be hitting the lift. So before I put the car on the lift, I actually got in here and removed the footwell trim panels on either side. You can see that one's off over there because that's how I get access to my 3-pin diagnostic connector for my NCM. So this is one NCM, and then our left-hand NCM's over there on the bottom footwell. Also, you can see that I pulled all this down and I've got access to my fuse panel. But as you can see up here, this is where I have all my individual connectors to do all my diagnostic here. You can see I had it hooked up from my airbag, my climate control there, and you can see there's just connectors kind of hanging out everywhere. And that's where you go plug in these SD cables to them so we can communicate with it. So even though this car is a 97 and it does have an OBD2 port, the factory Ferrari scan tool, everything is individual, one ECU and one connector at a time. However, you also want to pull this panel down and you want to get to this fuse box because they do have a lot of problems. What happens is they end up overheating on the high load circuits. Traditionally it's the cooling fans and the fuel pumps, and it will burn out the connectors inside this fuse box. So what you're going to want to do while you're down here is you're going to want to pull these connectors, each one off, and you're going to want to inspect the back side of this connector. When it starts to overheat, you'll see the discoloration, everything's deforming, it gets brown, real ugly, and the pin gets damaged. So you want to go through, check each one of those. You also want to go through, pull out the relays and inspect the board because again, you want to check for that high heat damage. There are companies that make upgraded boards or replacement boards to solve this problem. And if you're having weird or unusual electrical problems with your car, this is absolutely the first place you want to go to. This is a common problem on it. It also suffers, Testarossas have it. Really a lot of the cars of the era. I mean, this fuse box right here is pretty much the same as what's in a Testarossa. So you just want to go through and give that a good visual inspection. It really doesn't take too long to pull each connector out and inspect it. They are pinned specifically, meaning you can pop them all out. They only go back in one place, so it's pretty easy. You can't do anything wrong. But you're going to want to come in here and give this fuse box a good look over. You want to be sure that it's not causing your problems if you are having electrical issues, and you want to be sure that's in good condition and good health, so that way it's not going to cause any potential new problems down the road. Alright, just like the front, we need to get to the rear actuators, and a little bit different on this 456 opposed to like the 355, where you need to drop the shock out of the body of the car so we can get in there and inspect our actuators. So again, it's the same thing. We're doing the exact same check. We're checking for the plastic drive gear inside the actuator, making sure that's good. And I might be able to get you guys up in here now. And there you go. So you want to make sure, position my light a little better. So you want to make sure that this gear right here is not broken. And you want to make sure that it moves freely in both directions, which that's good. And this is that cup that I was talking about, now that we have a really good view, where that rotates on the 550s, or the upper shock mount rotates this cup and twists up your whole wire. So it's pretty easy. These are studs on the body, so you just take the nuts off on the bottom. The whole thing drops down low enough where you can get the clip off of this body. You can get your actuators free. You can give them a good inspection. And fortunately, we have 4 good actuators all the way around. None of the actuators are broken. None of my drive gears on the shocks are broken. None of them are leaking. Everything's in really good shape. And you can see that it gives us a good visual of the upper shock bushing here, or the shock mount. Everything's good there. I will say, on the 456s, they have the hydraulic rear suspension, and those shocks, or these shocks, actually do leak down here at the bottom. They are rebuildable, but that is one thing to keep an eye on. And once we're underneath the car, we'll get a better look at these shocks. But that is a specific item on 456s, is definitely look at your shocks, make sure that they're not leaking. So I figured I'd give you guys a little glimpse of what the shock looks like when it's fully reassembled back here in the rear. So you really just have these 2 17mm nuts that you need to loosen. That allows you to drop the shock down so you can inspect the actuator and gear. However, I will say that there is the rear sway bar that you need to contend with. So if you only release the shock from one side, it will drop down, but it limits you on how much space you have to get the actuator off, and you might be fighting it a little bit. But if you unbolt both sides at the same time, you're not going to be fighting the sway bar trying to twist it. And it's going to allow the suspension to fully droop, and then you have plenty of space, as you saw, to get that actuator off, inspect your gear, inspect your actuator, your shock mount, and get that good visual inspection. So since the studs are on the body and you just have 2 nuts to drop this off, it's very quick and easy to get this dropped down, to get that inspection done. And honestly, on an inspection like this, there's really no reason not to be dropping that down and getting a good visual inspection of the actuator and gear, because they are common failure points. Alright, so now let's take a peek underneath the car and up here at the engine. And I will say a lot of what we're covering here on this car, although this is a 456, it really applies to all the belt-driven V12 cars. So that's 456, 550, 575, 612. It's really pretty much the same engine when we're talking about the stuff down here. So you'll see we have our balancer up there where we have a much better look, where we can get up and check that rubber, the condition of that rubber. So it's hard to tell. You can see this one looks a little weird, but they do paint over everything. So it's hard to determine if that is the paint flaking off the rubber or if that's the rubber degrading. Since I know that I'm moving into a timing belt service, I'm not going to sweat it right now. I will give that balancer a much better inspection once it's off the car. But you guys might have already saw we have a bit of a oil drip right here. Now, this is worth talking about because this is a very common leak on this series of engines. You can see that we have this small cover right here, and that gives us access to the oil pump drive chain and gear that's behind this cover. So replacing the seal for this cover and getting this cover off is actually quite easy. We take this plastic timing cover off, and we should be able to pop those bolts off, get that replaced, put back on. However, there's also this mid housing right here that bolts on back here, so it could be this gasket back there that's leaking. So it's pretty hard to tell which one is leaking. We would really have to clean this off, put trace powder on it, and let it continue to leak to see which is the true source of the leak. This, honestly, this gasket, for me, it's a no-brainer. If we have this leak here, I'm going to just replace that anyways during the belt service. It doesn't really take much extra labor or time or money. There's no reason not to. If we're going to suspect this gasket back here, we have to pull this entire housing off, which if I had all these plastic covers off, you would see it houses what some people call the scissor gears or jack shaft gears, but there is a gear on the crankshaft that drives 2 smaller gears. So say the crankshaft's here, there's 2 smaller gears above it, kind of like where oil filters are, and that's what drives our timing belts. We would have to pull this entire assembly off and out in order to get that gasket replaced. So that's definitely something that you do during a timing belt service, because if you're doing that outside of a timing belt service, you're essentially going to have to do another timing belt service. So depending on what is actually leaking, your path forward is quite a bit different. If you have just this front cover leaking, it's pretty simple, easy repair, inexpensive. If it's this back gasket back there leaking from this cover, it's a lot more work. Really, the only way to truly know what is leaking is to clean all the oil off, clean it very well, get it out of all the cracks where the gaskets are, because that kind of tends to hold on to the oil. Put trace powder on it, run the car, and see where the oil starts to come back from. I know that this particular car hasn't had a timing belt service done since, I think, 2011. So it's been 14 years, and if that's all the oil that's been leaking out of there in 14 years, that's not too bad, and it's not really a gross leak to where we can give the customer the option during the timing belt service. Maybe we just replace this front cover, clean everything up, trace powder it, and it's not leaking at a rate where it's going to jeopardize it to the next timing belt service. Or if he's really particular and wants to just do it all now, we could just go for it all and replace this back gasket and pull the front cover. Really, that's where I feel on situations like this, it's up to me to give the customer all the options and kind of let them decide what is best for them in their car. So that's a pretty common leak, but other than that, there's really not a lot of other common oil leaks. I did notice on this car it has, get my light switched, you can see where it looks like it's leaking up there. If you look at that tube on that boss, fighting for hands here. So right up there, that tube is the oil drain tube from the head. And this looks like it's leaking, but I wiped my finger on it and it's not really wet and not really leaking. So it's deceptive. It looks like it's got an oil leak, but I don't have any oil dripping. I would say that's almost like a sweat, not really an oil leak. There's a good view of it. So I'm just going to note that to the client. I don't think that's worth pursuing or chasing. And while I'm down here at the tail end of the service, I'll probably clean that up and see if I can get that residual off so it doesn't look like it's had an oil leak. But I have seen sometimes that those oil drain tubes do leak. They're just sealed with O-rings. They unbolt from the head with 2 bolts up top. They're not really all too bad to get off and repaired. And also down here, which is specific to this particular car, I've seen a few 456s, but we have a radiator leak. So we're leaking out of this junction right here where this neck fits into the bottom tank. And we also have a leak over here. Leaking radiators on 456s is pretty common. Like I said, if you have a good, competent radiator shop, they can build you one like we have here. All right, so now we're at the bell housing at the back of the engine, and you can see that I have the heat shield off and the covers off, and it's a hot mess of wiring. So you can see that we have our primary or front O2 sensors for each bank, and these are the connectors and wiring for our crank sensors. And since this is, again, 2 ECUs, we have 2 crank sensors, so we have one on each side. And you can see that the wiring crosses, loops, intersects. So when you're down here working on the car or replacing something, definitely need to spend a little bit of time to be sure that you're tracing the right wire and the right sensor and you get everything connected correctly, because I have seen these where they are swapped and you have the wrong O2 sensor feeding information off of the wrong bank to the incorrect ECU. So those are areas to pay attention to. So another thing worth talking about back here comes back to our harmonic balancer. So there's not enough space to get that front bolt off of our balancer, and it's pretty tight. So you're going to have to use a ratchet and usually a cheater pipe to get that off, which isn't that big of a deal, but you need some way to hold the engine from rotating. Now, if this was a normal stick shift 456, it's usually not that big of a deal because you have your clutch pressure plate right here, and there's an opening where you can stick a pry bar and hold it right here against the bell housing, and that's going to prevent it from rotating, so you just have someone hold that in place back here, while someone else is at the front of the engine breaking that bolt loose. Since this is an automatic, you can see that we have a ton of space back here. I don't have that option, and I'm going to need to find a way to get this flex plate held in position. And I already have a plan, but that's not my point here. My point is if you look right here, this is our pickup wheel or reluctor wheel for our crankshaft sensors. Our actual flex plate is further back, so if you're going to stick a pry bar in here, do not stick it on this wheel. You would have to try to find a way to get it into the teeth back here where the starter goes on the flex plate. This, I can tell you, is only pressed on to this flex plate and flywheels of these 456s. And I've actually had one of these where it was starting to come off. It was losing its crank signal and the car wouldn't rev past 4,000 RPM. Went through quite a bit of diag time, so I finally came under here, looked at the car when it was running, and I saw this wobbling. This is not secured in any way to this flex plate or flywheel. Do not put a pry bar on here and try to rotate the engine with it or hold it in position, because you're just asking for a world of hurt. And since this car is a torque tube, you have a lot of labor to get everything out all your exhaust, your transmission, you get the torque tube out, they get your bell housing off, they get that replaced. Very labor intensive. So when you're working under here, just think that's a no-go zone. So let's move on and talk about the engine mounts, which are probably a more well-known wear item on these cars. Now, these commonly do fail, and there's several different ways you can determine if they have failed or if they're wearing. And when they do fail or wear, they start to sag where the engine starts to come and sit much lower. So obviously we're going to inspect here on the bottom side since we have a good view of the rubber, make sure there's no cracking, tearing, or anything that just looks out of place. And the really main way that I determine the health of these mounts is I get a mirror up here. I'm trying to get my camera up here to show you, but you can see the bolts that hold the mount into the frame, and you can see how close the engine support arm is to those. So when the rubber for these mounts starts to fail and sag, this support arm will come down and make contact on those bolts. So you'll kind of get a clunk or a vibration, some noise, or you can just see the wear pattern on it. So when I'm down here inspecting these, that's what I look for, and I look for the proximity of the arm to the top of the bolts and how much space I have, make sure they haven't made contact, make sure the rubber looks good. And I will say that usually when these get replaced, everyone recommends, or they should be recommending, to put in the 575 mounts. They're an updated mount. It is a better, superior mount, and it's a bolt-in affair. You need a little bit of extra or different hardware, but it goes in without modifications. So if you have an engine mount issue on these cars, go with the 575 mounts. Now I'm over here underneath the left front lower control arm, and we're looking at our bushings here. So there's two things to note on these bushings, much like our balancer. A lot of times they have a coat of black paint over them, so it looks like the bushing is cracking, and it's actually the paint. However, you can see in this case that we have a little bit of cracking. Let me grab a better view right there. You can see on the rubber that's sticking out on the outside. Now, I say that's to be expected on a car of this age, just because rubber deteriorates over time. And I would not necessarily say I'm going to recommend replacement on bushings like that on a car of this age. I really wait to see if I have play in the suspension bushings when I do my suspension shakedown. I can put a pry bar back here and pry on it and make sure I don't have excessive movement. Or if I have a noise when I'm driving and I can see that these bushings are starting to move and creating a noise, then I'm going to recommend the bushing replacement. But just because the rubber on the outside of the bushing that you see right there just has a little bit of cracking, doesn't necessarily mean the meat of the bushing where it's bonded to the inner sleeve and where it's pressed into this arm is torn and bad. So it's kind of like, yeah, cosmetically it's not great, but functionally this bushing's still tight. It's still doing what it needs to do. And I think in this particular case, it's a little bit overkill to go through and replace these bushings. Now, if this customer was beyond particular and wants this car to be in the exact condition that it was from day one from the factory and doesn't want anything that show any signs of wear and tear, I mean, sure, we would put bushings in it, but I think it's overkill at this point. So it's another one of those things where you just kind of have to take multiple factors into account when you're evaluating the bushings. Even though we have that little bit of visual cracking, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're failed and need replacement. All right, so we're here at the back of the car. You can see we have one fuel filter, our second fuel filter. These are the accumulators for the hydraulic shocks for our self-leveling suspension. If these fail, you're either going to burst a line or blow out a shock. That's going to be your symptom, or you're going to have an incredibly harsh ride. So if we get a good look, I mentioned it earlier that these shocks have a tendency to leak and they are rebuildable. So if you look at the top of this one, trying to get you guys up there. All right, there we go. We got you guys up there. So you can see on this rear shock, it has just a little bit of seeping, not necessarily a full-on leak. So that's another one to kind of advise the customer on. I don't necessarily think that's so bad right now that it's, necessitates pulling the shocks and completely rebuilding them. However, I would probably say that that is something that he might want to consider doing down the road. That leak's not going to get any better on its own, but it's also not profusely leaking right now. It's just a little bit of dampness there on the shock. And we kind of have the same thing over here on the driver's side. So usually when they're really leaking, you'll have fluid just dripping off. That's pretty minor in early stages of it. And speaking of leaks, we got our transmission back here, and we have a little bit of wetness here on the pan. And again, it's, leaks are subjective depending on what one's tolerance is for a leak.
I'd say this is definitely a seep, not really a leak. I guess it's kind of dripping there. But I will say that if these cars, or when these cars get a transmission service, you have to drop this pan. So who's to say if this gasket's leaking? Who's to say when's the last time this had a transmission service? Or if this is just residual from a transmission service and the last person wasn't very good at getting that cleaned off. So this is, again, another subjective area since we're not going to be going through and doing a transmission service on this car. I think my course of action during this service is to clean this oil off, get this residual off, and maybe just put a little bit of trace powder here to be sure that we can, in a future date, see the true source of this leak. But there's really not a lot up here that would leak. It probably would just be this lower pan gasket. And we also have this back cover gasket back here. So when you service these transmissions, you actually have to pull the back bumper off of the car to get this back pan off to get to the filter assembly. And this lower pan, you can get this cross member off and take care of that. So looking back here, we have 2B mufflers on this car. That's a nice little perk. All right, so we already talked about our ball accumulators up there. We talked about these hydraulic shocks. Now this whole system is ran off of the power steering fluid and the power steering pump. There's actually another tank over in the right front of the engine bay that controls it or supplies the fluid. And this is actually what controls the system back here. So this is our valve for the self-leveling. And if you see that we have this arm right here that goes up and connects to our sway bar up top there. So depending on the adjustment of this arm, we'll basically be telling the system how much the suspension is compressed and then how much to compensate with it with hydraulic fluid. So if there's a lot of weight in the back of the car and the suspension is very compressed, this is going to pick that up. It's going to add more hydraulic pressure back to the shocks, and that's going to allow them to expand more to compensate for the ride height. So this can affect your ride height on the car dramatically. So if you have your car sitting at an unusual ride height back here, you can make your adjustments back here, and then depending on how severely you changed it or how far off it was, you may need to have the car realigned. So there's really nothing to note on failure-wise back here. This is pretty robust, but if you're servicing it, just know that the adjustment of it is critical for the rear ride height. And the other talking point back here, which you can kind of see since I have the under tray off, is this is the rear spoiler where it drops down at high speeds, which we talked about on our road test. And I think if I get you spun around, you can see the assembly up there. So we have our motor and leakage, and it's a pretty simple system, and that is the same motor that operates the headlights up there. Not a huge failure item. I think I've replaced or kind of dealt with one failure back here on a car years ago, but other than that, the system's pretty robust and works as it should. So while we're back here, it might make sense to talk about how this whole drivetrain is mounted to the car. So we have the transmission back here at the back of the car, and it's bolted firmly to its torque tube. You can see right up here, which runs all the way up to the bell housing, and it's bolted firmly to that. So the engine is only bolted in with those 2 engine mounts in the front, and the other mounts are right back here holding in the transmission. So there's 4 mounts holding this whole unit into the car. Little bit different than what most cars have with the torque tube, but it adds a lot of rigidity to it. So knowing that these are the rear mounts of the car, you definitely want to come back here and inspect these just like the engine mounts. However, these ones, I haven't had as much issues with them because they don't have as much heat because the front mounts are right under the exhaust manifolds, right off the head, so there's more heat. Although you can see that this is our exhaust right here running right by the top. But by the time the exhaust gets this far back, it's not as hot as it is up in the engine bay. So I found that these actually last a little bit longer than your engine mounts, but it's still worth going through, doing the same inspection, getting a mirror on the top side, inspecting everything, and making sure you have no sagging, no tearing, nothing rubbing, and everything's the way it should be. So I think that's a pretty good quick little tour of the bottom side of this 456 and a few of the key areas that you want to be looking for when you're running through your inspection. Alright, so we had a pretty good look at the bottom side of this 456, and as one would expect for a car with low mileage like this one, it's actually in really good shape. So there is a couple things that I'll need to talk to the client about and see what he wants to do moving forward, but overall it was really nice under there and there wasn't any like big shocking findings. I think the most notable thing, which the client already knew about, was a leaking radiator. And that's going to be pretty simple in this case because I've already talked to the radiator shop and they are going to be able to go through and repair and reseal this radiator for us. So we're not looking at the cost of buying a new radiator for this car. It's merely going to be labor to get the radiator out to the shop, a little bit of labor there at the shop to get it repaired and back into the car. So in the grand scheme of things, that's going to be far cheaper than replacing the radiator with a new one or an aftermarket radiator. So really not that big of a deal, although it will be a bit of an added expense to the service. And other things that we found on the car, I mean, we noted that there's that slight oil seep on the right-hand side of the engine, kind of from the oil drain tube. I mean, it looks so much worse than it does. And when I touch the areas, there's really no oil leaking or getting on my hands on the side of the block. It just has like a different color to it where it looks like it's been leaking. That's so minor, I would have a really hard time selling extra work to go and chase that leak or replace those seals. So that's one of the things. Essentially, once I'm done with the entire service, I'll come through and clean that off, all that residual off, get it clean, have a fresh start, so that way we can give the car back to the client. And that's something to keep an eye on long term, because if that starts coming back, we can also judge at the rate that it's coming back, because what if it took 20 years to get like that? That's pretty minor if that's the case, or if it comes back like that in a month, then okay, maybe we have a leak. So it's one of those things that we will clean off and evaluate. And something that minor and that subjective, I kind of have a hard time on selling the seals so early. I'd kind of like to see it be a little bit more severe and show more signs of leaking before I'd really chase after it. On our front cover, that one's a little trickier because there's two options moving forward on how to go about sealing it. Honestly, since we're doing the belts, I think it's a given to, at the bare minimum, replace the front gasket, clean everything off, and see if the leak returns. The customer really wants to be very proactive and be sure that there's 100% not a leak there. We would remove the front cover all the way with the mid cover, get that off, get everything resealed. I'll probably mention to him, I think the best course of action is replacing the front gasket, cleaning everything off, putting some trace powder on it, running the car, and seeing what he wants to do. The only downside is if we do that and put the car back together and it continues to leak, we have new timing belts on the car that would have to come off in order to address the leak. So that's more of like a situational thing that is going to be different per the client on what they want to do with the car and their long-term plans for the car. But I need to present that information to him and let him decide what's going to be the best path forward. And I think the only other thing that we really saw in the car was the transmission pan seep at the rear and the slight leak from both of the shocks. Again, kind of the same thing, super subjective. The transmission pan wasn't dripping. It's not low on fluid level. There's just not enough evidence there to say, yes, we need to chase after that. So that's going to be another clean and monitor. And the shocks, a little bit different of an area there because there's enough evidence to say, yes, that they are leaking, but I wouldn't say that it's a critical leak or a failure just yet. They have that seep up on the top. There's the wetness there, but there's no oil dripping down any further. Generally, it gets pretty prominent when those do leak. So they are starting to leak. They could probably benefit from maybe a rebuild down the road, but there's also still plenty of life left in them. So it's hard to say. Again, that's kind of the information that I need to present to the client. I have pictures and videos. We have those conversations, and my job is only to tell him the condition of the car, answer his questions, and it's up to him to decide what we're going to do moving forward. Now you'll see that I have the car off the lift and pulled forward, and that's actually because I spent all of today kind of chasing after some of the other issues on the car that needed a little bit more time and attention above and beyond our normal inspection. So the main items that we were chasing today, which we mentioned during the inspection, was our check engine light. Spent a little bit of time on that. We had our issue with our lack of communication to our airbag control unit, so I spent some time on that. We had our issue with our shifter solenoid that wasn't operational, so we looked into that a little bit. And the other one was like the fuel door and this window. So I looked at each one of those items really just enough to basically come to a conclusion or determination to what we need to do moving forward. Oh, there's the other thing too, is the cooling fans weren't working. We looked into that today. So I think I'll just start with what I found on the cooling fans. And the customer mentioned this to me. I did verify it. The cooling fans cycle completely fine if you have the climate control on. It doesn't matter if it's on heat or AC, but as long as the climate control is on, the cooling fan cycle, the car runs great. It'll sit and idle all day long. If you have the climate control turned to the off position, so zero fan speed moving whatsoever, the fans would not operate and the car would start getting warm. I verified that, so when I drove the car on my test drive, I actually had it on AC the whole time. I was trying to load the system as much as I can with the AC on, and the car ran great, no temperature issues whatsoever. Then I had it in the shop. When I was letting it run, I had the climate control off, and I caught it. It was starting to get warm, so we shut the car down. So I was able to verify that. And at the bottom of the radiator is a coolant temperature switch, and that switch controls the activation of the cooling fans. So in this particular case, I found that that switch has failed. Now, the way that I found that it has failed is I measured the continuity of the switch in the radiator with the car cold before I started it up this morning, and I had an open circuit, which is what I would expect. Then I jumpered the connector on the harness side with the key on the car, and once I jumpered that connector, which would simulate a closed switch, the fans came on and ran. So by jumping that connector, that's telling me that I have good power supply, my fuses are good, my relays are good, really the fans are functioning. It basically verified the entire electrical system of the fans. So then, knowing that, that's pretty much all the information I need to know that that switch is bad, but I went just a little bit further. I fired the car up, got it warm, got it up to temperature, went back to the switch, did one more continuity test, again, confirmed that it's open circuit. So when the car gets warm or the radiator gets warm, that switch should go from an open circuit to a closed circuit to turn those fans on. So I was able to verify that, and we need just a new switch into the radiator, which is going to be pretty easy because we're going to have the radiator out, so it's just the cost of parts. We'll save the check engine light for last. We'll talk about that at the very end. Is what I think I will talk about is, let's talk about our shifter interlock here. And I had the car in the lift. It was sitting here for a couple days. I actually hopped in it to fire it up and pull it forward to test the shift interlock, and the shift interlock wasn't working whatsoever. So when you turn the key on and push the brake, this plunger right here on this solenoid slides in like so. And that's what allows the shifter to come back and out of gear. So I was like, perfect, it's failed. I need to get access to it, get access to the connector so I can measure the voltage of it in its operation. Murphy's Law. Once I got everything out, got to the connector, got everything tested, it started working again. So, inconclusive on that, but it did give me a chance to get down here and test the solenoid, because I've mentioned that I felt that there was a strong potential that there was some sticking grease that could be causing the issue. And once I got in here and looked at this solenoid and how it's set up, I don't think that's probably going to be the case. And also the solenoid is moving nice and free. So really, I've just left my multimeter here. You can see where I have my pins back probed into the connectors. So anytime I start the car and go to put it in gear, I have my meter ready to go, and I can just continue to monitor it. And as what I'm going to be looking for is to be sure that I have 12 volts switching here and the solenoid not working. So that's going to basically tell me that the control side of the circuit's fine and it's a solenoid problem. Or if I find that when the solenoid is not working and I don't have voltage there, then it's a problem within the circuit itself, not the solenoid. And I can kind of do the same thing to further verify, like I did on the coolant switch on the radiator. I can apply 12 volts to the solenoid. Say if it's not working, I can manually apply 12 volts to it here. And if the solenoid works, then I know it's a control side of the circuit. So I kind of need it to fail and act up again before I can dig deeper into it, before I have that accurate information. So, I mean, sure, we could just throw a solenoid in it, but I don't know if that's actually the problem right now or not. So I think it's kind of senseless just to throw parts at the car on a hunch if we don't actually know it's going to be failing, especially since it's failed on me twice. I just need to catch it with my multimeter hooked up, and it's going to give me more information either to solve the problem or which direction to start looking into the problem. Now, I did mention the fuel door actuator was not working as well. Again, I've operated that since the car's been in the shop, and I've not been able to repeat that issue. And I was hoping whatever I was going to find here, which I thought was going to be the grease on our shift solenoid, would be related, but it's not. So with this fuel door issue, the best thing I can do is just periodically operate it when I'm in the car, make sure that the fuel door is opening and operating just fine, hoping that maybe once I'll catch it when it does not operate, so I can see if it's the same thing, basically as a solenoid. Do I have a wiring issue? Do I have a solenoid issue? Is it an adjustment issue? The solenoid's not operating. I really need to catch it in the act so I can understand what's not working, so then I can move forward. If it's not going to act up on me, there's not a whole lot I can do right now. So the other thing we're going to talk about over here is our window. Now, I showed it earlier, but when the door is shut and the window's rolled all the way up, we have a large gap right here. I mentioned that window regulators on 456s are a chronic problem. Actually, it's kind of twofold. Window adjustments are a big problem on 456s, but really, a lot of times you can't get the windows readjusted because it's a worn out or a failed window regulator. Now, I did have a little bit of play on this window regulator when I was moving the window, And I did compare it to the driver's side, which that window regulator or window seals completely fine as it should. And it's the exact same on side to side. So I was able to do other checks without pulling the door panel on this window regulator. I was able to get a small flashlight in between our two weather stripping seals, and then you're able to look in here and look at the track and the window regulator itself. And I was mainly looking for the center pivot to make sure that it wasn't loose and there wasn't any play in there. And from looking in there and moving the window regulator around, I didn't see anything abnormal or concerning. I don't think we have an issue with the window regulator over here on the right hand side, and is what I'm going to advise the client is see how much time he wants me to spend on it readjusting the window. And I think if I can control or limit how much the window is pushing up once it sits into the seal, maybe reduce the amount of upstroke that it has, it's going to limit how far it's pushing out, because is what it feels like as the window goes up and hits the stop and then it's still trying to lift up. So then it bows the window out to compensate for that. So if we could reduce that stroke a little bit, it should still slide up into the seal where it needs to sit and sit tight on this side. So we'll just relay that information to him and see what he wants to do moving forward. So moving on from the window regulator, let's talk about our airbag light. I mentioned when I had the SD1 hooked up to the car that I was not able to communicate with the airbag control unit. Now, I initially delayed this because I thought once I got to the shifter solenoid, I'd have more access to the airbag control unit. My memory kind of duped me. I thought it was further back in the center console, but it's actually up in the front of the shifter. So I was a little fortunate, I guess. Let me get my flashlight to work. There we go. I was a little fortunate in its location because I was able to pull this side trim panel off of the transmission tunnel here. And I don't know if we can get a view in here with my light, but you can see that the airbag control unit's right there with that kind of orange connector. You can see I have the wire harness out right here. So this is a pretty early airbag system, meaning there's not a lot of inputs or outputs to it. And I'll say that whenever I'm diagnosing something, I break everything down to the inputs and outputs of a computer. So this is our connector right here, and I will say that if you look on the back side, which is common on airbag systems, they have bridges. So when you disconnect this connector from the control unit, it has these bridges that short out each pin. So if you're doing pin checks here, you're going to have to be aware of your bridges because they'll fool you. You have to know that this could be shorting out multiple pins. But all of our wires are right here on this side, and essentially is what it comes down to is these first two wires. I can't remember which. I think that's the driver's airbag. Second two is the passenger airbag. These two middle wires right here are our communication lines to our connector, which is right here. This pink wire, which is the third one in, is for our airbag warning light in the instrument cluster. The black wire, second one in, is our ground, and the first pin right here is our power. So, like I mentioned, we can't communicate with the airbag control unit. I break everything into inputs and outputs. The airbags themselves are not going to cause a communication issue to the airbag control unit, so we can eliminate those wires, and those are also outputs where it activates the airbags. So that leaves us with 5 wires, right? The most important wires that we want to check are the 2 communication line wires. So I was getting access to this connector because I wanted to measure the continuity of these 2 wires to the connector. So I measured the resistance of these wires one at a time individually from this connector to where they can connect to the ECU to be sure that I have good continuity, which both of them did. There was no problems found there. So then we just do our other basic checks, right? I made sure that I had switched 12 volts to the airbag ECU. Again, nothing unusual. Made sure that I had a good ground, continuity of the ground, nothing unusual. And I will say here on the airbag light, so even with the airbag control unit unplugged from the car completely, the airbag warning light still displays in the instrument cluster. So that is logical to me because, say, if you unplug the airbag control unit like I have now, it needs to advise the driver of the car that there is a problem with the airbag system. If you unplug the control unit and the warning light goes away, someone would have no way of knowing that the airbags are not operational. The way the system works is the airbag warning light or the cluster provides 12 volts into the airbag control unit. When that wire is grounded to chassis ground, then the light turns off. So there's some sort of processor or, a chip inside the airbag control unit. So when you turn the power on, the airbag control unit's going to go through and do its basic resistance checks on the driver and passenger airbag to make sure they check out. And if they check out just fine, then the airbag control unit is going to complete that circuit for the warning light to turn the light in the instrument cluster off. So if there's a problem, the airbag control unit's going to leave that circuit open and the light's going to stay on, like the problem we have right now. I say this as in if you have a failed airbag control unit, the light can still stay on. That's its default position. And that's really what we have right now. So I went through and did my basic checks. I have switched 12 volts at my airbag control unit. I have a good ground at my airbag control unit. All my communication wires from the airbag control unit to my diagnostic connector are correct. My airbag warning light wire in the cluster is working just fine because I pulled it out of that connector and I grounded it out and my warning light went off. And I'm not worried about either of the airbag wires to the driver and passenger airbag at this time because I can't even talk to the control unit. So essentially that tells me what I need to know, that the problem is inside the airbag control unit. And I will say that these early airbag control units are very sensitive to voltage. So if you try to start the car with a low battery or low voltage, it has a tendency to damage these ECUs where they just stop working. So again, it's one of those things, I got to present all this information to the client. There are several companies out there that supposedly repair these control units, but most of the stuff that I have seen is more so on clearing hard faults out of them after the car has been in an accident. I haven't seen much talk about repairing this control unit for an issue with a potential low voltage, which is what I suspect. I don't have any proof of it, and the client didn't mention that this car ever had issues with low voltage, but I've seen it before, and if I recall, I think I actually had it happen to me once with a 355 that was in the shop that I was working on, and at some point during the repairs, it ended up getting an airbag light, which was a control unit. Vague. I think I remember that. So that's really what we're going to have to present to the client. I'm going to say, hey, we should probably pull that airbag control unit out, at least send it out and see if someone can repair it. If not, we're going to need the replacement. And I think I doubt we can get a new airbag control unit from the factory on that. I think we're going to have to find a new, good, used unit. So we got the information we need with the airbag control unit. The last thing we need to talk about is the check engine light. All right, so let's talk about this check engine light. When I first scanned the car, I had a fault for an aging O2 sensor on the left-hand bank and also an O2 sensor signal for the left-hand bank. I had 0 faults on the right-hand bank Motronic. Now, when I checked my parameters, I noticed that I had no fluctuation in my voltage from my front or primary O2 sensor on the left-hand bank, and the car was stuck in open loop. On the right-hand bank, the car was in closed loop, full operation of my O2 sensors. So that I thought was going to be pretty easy, but then the second time I scanned the car, it changed it up on me where I then had the fault on both banks, matching faults, aged O2 sensors primary, and then the O2 sensors signal fault. Although the parameters that I was checking were showing both O2 sensors cycling normally, and the car was in closed loop on both banks. And it's been that way ever since then. Every time I fire the car up, scan for faults, that's what I have. I can tell you from past experience that I know that the aged O2 sensor fault essentially is what that's telling me is the Motronic is not happy with the switching rate of the O2 sensors. Meaning the Motronic is reading the O2 sensors, it's making fuel chim corrections on the injector pulse width, and it's not seeing a correlating change in the O2 sensors that match the change that are requested with the injectors. Now, I had this once on a 456, ironically enough, a GTA. Murphy's Law hit me on this one because when this client dropped the car off, he took me out to lunch, and I was just chatting with him about 456s, and I was telling him about this previous car that I had to have these faults and how it was the only time I've ever seen these faults. And lo and behold, his car has these faults. So on the other car that had these faults, it's a pretty great story, and maybe sometime I'll dig into that one in a bit more detail. But what I actually found is that the car was serviced by a different shop, and then it went through a whole string of other shops because it had a chronic check engine light that no one could solve. And what I ended up finding is when it had its timing belt service, usually these intake manifolds get removed for the timing belt service to gain access to the valve covers. I have seen some people that pull the plenums off and leave the base intake manifold on and get the valve cover off. My method is to pull the whole intake, and I presume that was what was done at this previous shop on this other car. What they ended up doing, though, is when you pull the intake manifold, there is 2 round cannon plugs basically on the back side. It's buried back there underneath the cowl for the fuel injector wire harness, one for each side, the left and right hand side. In typical Ferrari fashion, you can plug those in either side. They're not keyed to a specific side, so they actually swapped those wire harness connectors. So that meant that the left-hand ECU was firing the injectors on the right-hand side of the engine. And then I presume, I don't know the sequence of events, but I presume they had O2 sensor faults and a bunch of issues because obviously the ECUs were confused from not even seeing the right O2 sensor inputs based on what the injectors are doing because they're crossed, that they ended up swapping the primary O2 sensor connectors, which is pretty easy to do on these cars. So I don't really know the sequence of events, and I don't know how the car ran once they had that, but I ultimately found that they not only had the fuel injector connector swapped, but they had the primary O2 sensor connector swapped, so everything was just really a hot mess on reading the correct bank and really seeing its adjustments. So all I had to do to fix that car was swap my fuel injector connectors back from left to right, and then swap my O2 sensor connectors back, and the car ran great. So, knowing that information on this car, obviously that's the first thing I went through and checked. So I gave a visual inspection on all my wire harness for my fuel injectors. I went under the car and I traced out all of the wiring for my O2 sensors to make sure they feed to the right ECU. And got a little diagram that'll show you that makes a little bit more sense. This happened to actually be notes that I had from the other car that I diagnosed. I just print this out of the workshop manual so I can write notes on it. But we got the front of the engine here, the back of the engine here. This is our left-hand Motronic ECU, and if we trace all this wiring, you can see that our rear O2 sensor feeds into the ECU, our primary O2 sensor feeds into the ECU. This is our CAT ECU here. Again, everything on the left-hand side is staying with the left-hand ECU. You get up here, and this right here is our crank sensor connector, and our crank sensor is actually positioned on the right-hand side, so this does show the crank sensor crossing. And then here is our fuel injector plugs that I was just talking about. So you can see that their feeds right into the left-hand ECU. So they actually had this one plugged in over here on the other side. And I mean, really everything is left-hand, right? So it's a left-hand side of the engine or right-hand side of the engine. The only caveat to this is our intake air temp, airflow meter, idle valve, TPS sensors. If we follow this wiring over, you can see that it feeds over to the left-hand ECU, but it's on the right-hand side of the engine. And that's because our plenums cross in. So you can see that this plenum runner is running into this head, feeding the left-hand side of the engine. This is our left-hand side fuel injector, but all those components are over here on the right-hand side. So these have to feed all that information to the left-hand ECU, even though they're on the right-hand side of the car. So it's a little bit confusing when you're diagnosing the car, especially considering that the car has two ECUs. You can see them right here, and they're independent of one another, although they do share a communication line, because we do have, as an example, just one crank sensor over here on bank 1, and this ECU needs to know that information, so it's shared via that line. So getting those crossed up is obviously going to really change how this runs. So like I mentioned, knowing all that, that's the first thing I checked on this car, and I verified that all my O2 sensors on the left side are on the left side of the car feeding the left side ECU, that the left-hand injectors are on the left-hand side connected to the left-hand ECU. And I didn't find anything unusual on this car whatsoever. Everything is set up and essentially how it needs to be. And the thing that's unusual about this is everything's separate, right? So I have two ECUs, two crank sensors, two separate, exhausts. The exhaust doesn't merge in anywhere. So I have two separate O2 sensors, catalytic converters, post O2 sensors, the fuel injectors, the two of everything. The only thing that they share is a crankshaft. And it's the same fuel engines running on, and it's the same air, but other than that, it's two separate engines. So if I have this fault, which is unusual that I had it on one bank and then it emerged on two banks, I say it's unusual when it's on two banks because there's not a lot of things on the engine that are going to cause that issue on both banks. So if I have a failed O2 sensor on, let's say it's a bad O2 sensor in the left-hand bank, that's not going to have any effect on the right-hand bank. So it would be highly unusual that I would have two bad primary O2 sensors at the same time with the exact same faults. That's pretty unlikely and pretty unusual. So here's my train of thought with this. I know the engine has great compression. I know all my harnesses are connected properly. And I also know that it's not very likely that I would have the same failure on both banks at the same time, especially a failure that I haven't seen frequently. So it's a little unusual, and the car's not really giving me a lot to go off of. And when I look at my parameters, I see normal function on my O2 sensors. We're in closed loop. And I do remember on the last car that I had, it did take about 20-30 miles of driving for these faults to reappear for the aged O2 sensor faults. So maybe these are faults that were stored a while ago. They're not currently present. It's hard to say. This isn't my normally go-to, but in this case, I think it is more suitable because it's a better use of my time. It prevents the customer from having to spend extra money with me just starting to spin my wheels, just checking things to check them on this car. So really where I think the best path forward here is I'm going to move into the timing belt service. Now, I say this because during the timing belt service, I'm going to have the intake manifold off, which is going to give me access to pretty much the entire wire harness for the engine. So I can make sure that that's not crossed on the bottom side of the intake manifold. That is still a possibility. But I need to make sure that that is the way it needs to be. But I can check our intake manifold gaskets, all of our vacuum lines, all of our grounds for the valve covers. Essentially, I'm going to have my hands everywhere. And I'm going to be able to at least see it, touch it, feel it as I'm working on the car. And maybe I will come across a smoking gun and have something that's like, oh, this could be causing the problem. Another thing to talk about is the car is going to be getting fresh spark plugs. We're going to be setting the cam timing back on spec. And we will be servicing the fuel injector. So I'm going to pull the fuel injectors out. We're going to run them through my injector cleaner. We'll do a flow test before we clean them. We'll clean them and do a flow test afterwards because maybe we see something unusual with the injectors, and that's going to make us investigate a little bit deeper into the fuel system because just like 550s, the early 456s do have problem with the rubber hangers in the fuel tanks where the fuel pumps deteriorating and starting to clog the system, get into the filters. And I mean, heck, I'm going to be putting fuel filters in the car so I can cut the fuel filter open, see how contaminated it is. My point being, why I'm doing the service on the car, I'm going to have my hands on a lot of components. I'm going to be replacing a lot of things, and I'm going to have a lot of access to other things where I can be making a lot of other checks and building up a lot of known good variables and parts on the car at no extra cost to the client. And essentially when I'm diagnosing cars, I have an analogy that I like to use, and a lot of people go looking for a needle in a haystack. That's how they diagnose a car. So they just start digging around the haystack until they find the needle. And my philosophy is very different. I like to remove hay from the haystack until I find the needle, because no matter what, if I systematically remove that hay and I'm sure there's not a needle in that hay, I will come across that needle. And I'm a firm believer that that method is much quicker because I have a big pile of known good information. I'm not making assumptions. So just going through and do simple things like cleaning, flow testing our injectors, visually getting a known, yep, these injectors are good. We got good spark plugs, cam timing, all the wire harness. That helps build my case of all known good variables. That way, if we have the car on the tail end, we get done with the service, say I take it for an extended test drive, the fault comes back, I don't have to make assumptions on those items. I know they're good, and it reduces the amount of potential items that could be causing that problem. So, I know that was a lot, ran through it, but that is my plan on the check engine light. Long story short, we're going to move into the service, get the car serviced, get everything replaced, get the car back on the road, reevaluate the check engine light on the tail end, see if it reemerges or not. Maybe it'll get addressed along the way. All right, so our inspection is behind us, and we now know that we have a pretty well sorted, very clean, low mileage 456 on our hands. Sure, it has loose odds and ends that need sorted, but honestly, the customer was aware of most all of those when he brought it to me, so none of that will be a surprise to him, and I'm pretty sure he has plans to go through and get most of those items sorted and addressed. So where do we go from here? Well, this is only half of the work for me. I need to compile all my notes, all my documentations, all my videos, get that information over to the client so we can carry those conversations and he has the information that he needs to make the decisions moving forward on what repairs we will be doing and won't be doing to this particular car. In the meantime, is what I'll probably do when I'm out here is I'll probably get started on the teardown for this timing belt service. So you're definitely going to want to hang out, stick around, keep an eye on the channel. I'm going to walk you guys through all the steps to getting this engine torn down. Really going to walk you through the entire timing belt service, much like we did with the 355 that I just completed. So with that, guys, I wanted to thank you very much for your support. Thank you for watching the channel. I really do appreciate it. So be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also get in the comment section and be sure that you're leaving your comments on the videos. As always, guys, I appreciate your support. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.